Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today as co-host is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing well, and we are going to have an exciting program today and a special guest. And that is somebody that will be well known to our audience and our viewers because he literally changed the whole scene on libertarianism. And this is Lew Rockwell. I've known for a long time, been since the 70s. And I give him a lot of credit for the work that he's done with the Mises Institute, because as far as I'm concerned, that's where the activity has to be. We have to change people's minds. And I was telling Daniel a little while ago that Lew has no idea how many people he's influenced. And if you're in the business of ideas and influence, nobody knows, because I think, Lew, so much of what you've done there, the students that have gone through there, and the teachers that have gone out and gone to the universities, there would be a sad story if we could make a list and say, well, okay, we have 350 now. No, it's unlimited. Lew, I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and looking forward to seeing you soon in Alexandria, Virginia.
Ron, of course, it's an honor to be with you, and I'm very much looking forward to the Ron Paul Institute conference in not D.C., thank goodness, but near D.C.
Right. Daniel?
Well, Lew, I want to welcome you too, because I'm so thrilled to have you back on the show. We could probably have Lew every day, and it would be, but there wouldn't be, Dr. Paul, there wouldn't be a Ron Paul Institute really without Lew Rockwell, because he guided us so much from the beginning, 35 plus years of experience with the Mises Institute. And in fact, we sort of model what we do on a small scale on what they have done, including, our upcoming Scholars Seminar is modeled in a small scale after their Mises University. So, Lew, my debt of gratitude to you is unending and unpayable. So thank you for joining us.
Daniel, it's great to be with you, of course.
Very, very good. We do want to touch on some issues, and of course, the conference will be mainly on foreign policy. But I remember a debate, so-called debate, during the presidential campaign, and we were in Detroit, and it must have been '07, because the issue was to be economics. And I remember being annoyed that one week they talk about foreign policy, and next week they would talk about economic policy. And I have trouble separating the two. How can you talk about foreign policy without dealing with what it does to the economy? But the subject came up then about could we possibly be moving into a recession? And it was all the Republicans were on the stage, and I found myself among people who didn't understand Austrian economics. And I made the statement, and I was almost positive, but it turned out to be pretty good, because I said we're already in a recession, and it was only a month or two that everybody knew we were in a recession. And I think there's a lot of talk, again, Lew, under today's circumstances of what's going on. There's a lot of talk, but I think we're probably a little bit further along into the recession than anybody wants to admit. But how do you see things stacking up? I imagine you're not expecting a booming, healthy, free market economy here this next year.
No, when you look at the things that are going on, the amount of spending that's going on, all the crazy things the Fed is doing, and also its adjuncts at the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan and other central banks that are controlled by the U.S. Central Bank. It's like they want to bring on a depression, and I'm afraid that they're going to be successful.
Right. Daniel?
Well, Lew, it just takes a second looking through the headlines to see there's something pretty wrong with our foreign policy. We looked in, I saw an anti-war today, the U.S. seized a ship carrying food to Venezuela. We're supposed to be mad because Maduro's not providing food for the people, and now we're seizing food. Just off camera, we were talking about how the Chinese have found a few of our CIA guys over there stirring things up in Hong Kong, and I know that's a shocker. What do you think is happening to Trump? Because it almost looks like, I guess we may give him too much credit on the show sometimes, but it almost seems like, the neocons are playing monkey in the middle, with him in the middle, and they keep throwing the ball over his head, and he keeps jumping to try to grab it, and they're running circles around him, in all of these places. What would you say? What do you think is happening in this administration?
Well, of course, it's very disappointing. I was one of those who very naively actually had hopes that he might keep some of his campaign promises. And I guess he's done some good things in deregulation and some other areas like that. But his foreign policy, of course, has been terrible. And he hasn't made peace with Russia. He seems to want a war with China. obviously war with Iran, war with Venezuela. They're tightening the sanctions on Cuba and Nicaragua. It's just a terrible thing. And these sanctions are in some ways worse than bombings. I mean, they actually, of course, are considered acts of war and always have been, but they seek to starve and sicken the people on the idea that the people will then overthrow their government out of anger at it. Of course, that has never happened. It's never happened in the history of the world. People get to defend their government because they feel everybody's under attack by the hegemon, the U.S. So it's sickening to see the U.S. strangling people, whether it's in North Korea or Iran, and making these countries much worse than they would have been otherwise. I mean, it seems to me a criminal affair. President Trump, is he? I mean, I don't know. I mean, just look at what he did over these terrible shootings in El Paso and in Dayton. Although nobody talks about the equal number of shootings that took place over the weekend in Chicago. Somehow that's not part of the narrative. But I don't know. He's apparently going to have more internet. He's actually calling for more big tech censorship, which of course the Congress will be very glad to give him. And he's calling for so-called red flag laws, which would actually give the government the power to seize anybody's guns just without due process, just grab them. And because maybe you have quote unquote dangerous ideas, maybe you believe in a conspiracy theory, meaning you're not accepting the government's official story about some event. It's a totalitarian measure, and I'm afraid I hope the Congress won't go along with it, but I'm afraid they're going to go along with it and worse things in terms of restricting gun ownership. I do notice, and I'm very glad to see, massive gun sales ever since these shootings. So people are protecting themselves, but and of course, as somebody who used to be at the NRA pointed out, when the government goes around to seize people's guns, what are they going to use as tools? Guns. So
I was thinking about this the other day, and I was trying to get the exact number of people in America that owns a gun, and I couldn't find the exact number, but you can find the number of how many guns are out there, and there are millions and millions of them, and they want to regulate them. And in this last several months, we've had these mass killings, and they're terrible, horrible, and we condemn them. But in numbers, Lew, you already pointed out what was going on in Chicago. But if you look at these mass killings, 15 here, 20 here, and the number of guns, it's really minuscule compared. Even another comparison, even much bigger than what's happening in Detroit and Chicago, is what happens with the government guns. I want to regulate the government guns because it's estimated now that there could have been 700,000 civilians killed by our bombing over those 10, 15 years, and it continues to happen because they don't all get reported, and all the Americans who have suffered from this. So, and that's bipartisan, but that is never talked about. Republicans don't want to talk about it. Democrats don't want to talk about it, but the message never gets out that yes, guns are a problem, and that's why the government ought to reduce drastically the number of guns they have, especially their big guns and the bombs that they have. And then, of course, the ultimate protection would be to have decent people defining our foreign policy of less aggression. Maybe we could, move along in that direction. But this whole idea on attack of guns, I think I think it's going to be much more serious, but I don't think it's going to work. That's my guess. I think there'll be a civil war before they go knocking on doors. That is not going to happen. And fortunately, I think the same way the people in the 30s were very complacent. Oh, FDR says turn into gold. The American people did it. But what about? Are they going to turn in their guns? No, they're not. They're not going to. And the hatred and the animosity between the two groups, I think, is getting much worse. Lew, how would you compare the conditions of this hatred and fractionalism that's going on to other events in your lifetime?
I think it's no question it's the worst. I mean, of course, we've read about FDR's seizure of the people's gold. There was some animosity over that, but most people, I'm sorry to say, just went along and turned in their gold. And I think you're right, this is not going to happen this time. But the unbelievable animosity, I mean, when you see, for example, divorces happening because people have different political views, and just people losing their jobs, people being attacked in the street because they have the wrong hat on. It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime, and I fear, as you point out, we're headed towards a civil war, and the government is going to stoke it. And I must say, as you point out, every time I see these Democrats or Republicans in these debates and or other forums, and they're talking about gun violence. We must end gun violence. Gun violence, terrible thing, but they're for all the wars. Whereas you point out how the U.S. has killed millions of people over the years in its wars, and it's of course that's okay. Americans, I'm sorry to say, I don't think they care a lot about that. They ought to care a lot about it. And you've been talking about this all your life, and it's you've made a huge impact, and we need more. We need more Ron Paul. We need more Ron Paul ideas. We need more Murray Rothbard ideas against war. Murray, when he was a very young man, wrote a letter that we have in our archives where he said that he'd come to the conclusion that the key central aspect of libertarianism was the war and peace question. It was more important than anything else, even though there are many, many other things of extreme importance. But the question of war and peace was the key one. And I think, the Ron Paul Institute and Mises Institute agree on that point, that it's a very, that's what we need to worry about. And all the animosity the U.S. is rising up against itself all over the world, whatever they have a poll about which country is the most feared and most hated, the U.S. always comes in first. And Americans, or if they even read about it, they're shocked. Oh, well, how can that be? We don't doing anything. We're just great guys. We're wonderful. We just are terrific. But of course, the people are being starved. The people are being bombed. People are being threatened, and otherwise their lives manipulated. All their elections manipulated. I always get a kick out of the U.S. talking about the Russian manipulation. U.S. has an agency that actually is in charge of manipulating another country. It's an open agency in charge of manipulating another country's elections, and it manipulates more than 100 elections every election cycle. So this, of course, this is just freedom. This is a wonderful thing. Yeah. But the U.S. is doing a lot of bad stuff overseas and internally, and I fear for what's ahead for all of us and for people around the world. As this continues and intensifies.
Yeah, I think what we're saying is that they're hypocrites when something like the two recent incidents that just occurred is an excuse just to regulate people, regulate our liberties, and take away our guns. But they don't, and then they also make it a racial thing too. Oh, white people just did this, white people did this. But what did they? What has happened to even expressing an interest about the worst incident in my lifetime on our soil, where 3,000 people killed, and they were killed, and they weren't killed by one white guy with a machine gun. They weren't even killed with a gun. They were killed by knives. So it's so inconsistent, but the people fall in line and listen to all this. But I just think that ultimately, Lew, I always go back and I try to follow what you've done in the Mises Institute, is emphasize the change in attitudes. The kind of government we want and have is a reflection of the people's attitudes. And when the people's attitudes change, our government will change. And I think back, when the founders wrote up our Constitution, they did have an attitude about what the Constitution and what the role of government ought to be. So that's a different story. But you've been doing that for a lifetime, and that's why you deserve a lot of credit. Daniel?
Well, Lew, we wanted to have you on because you're going to be a big top speaker at the Ron Paul Institute conference. It's great to have you and Dr. Paul together again on the stage. I think we missed out last year, so we're super excited to have you. I know how much you love coming to Washington, but and we want to get people excited. We want people to come out and see you, see Dr. Paul, and So it's very important. But I had a kind of a two-part question. First of all, we called the show today Rothbard and War, which is what your speech is going to be like. And I don't want you to give away too much. We've got to keep a little bit, but maybe give a taste of what kind of things you're going to sing. And the second part is, the Mises Institute is an inspiration to us, but you do hundreds of conferences. You do them all the time. They're very successful. People get out of their daily routines, they get together. What would you say to someone? Because we want to have a full house, as you know, and we always do, but it's important. What would you say to someone who's why should I get out? Maybe I don't want to go out there. I don't take the time. I agree with them. What would you say to people that feel like this? If you could maybe just do a kind of a two-parter for me.
Well, I've been at two of these conferences, and they're very exciting. People come from not only all over the country, they come from all over the world, and it's because, of course, it's a Ron Paul conference. It's the chance to have your picture taken with Ron, a chance to hear him. But there are other speakers, too. This year it's going to be David Stockman, the tremendous expert on what's happening with the economy, and Colonel McGregor, who's on the Tucker Carlson show so often, and is a guy from inside the military, a voice for sanity. And really, it's not only are the speakers exciting, your fellow guests are exciting, and it's just great to meet all these people. You can make permanent friendships, and it's just $80. I mean, it's an extraordinary conference, and it includes a hot lunch and refreshments all day long, and it really is. It's a tremendous experience, and there are hundreds of people who go, and it's been a sellout the years I've been there, and I think and hope it will be a sellout again this year. But if you have believe me, you will regret not having gone if you don't go. This is going to be, again, these things are extremely exciting. The speakers are exciting. You'll learn a lot. Even though we're talking about very serious subjects, very unfortunate subjects in some cases, it's fun to learn, and it's important to learn. It's so important that you learn what the government is doing and maybe what we can do about it. So it's an extraordinary experience to be at this conference. Ron, you ought to be charging $800, but you're kind and you're not. You're charging $80. So I think it's just I'm honored to be asked to be there, not only because of all the speakers, Ron, of course, preeminently, but just because of all the guests, the people who are there. Ron, you draw the best people in America to your conferences, and I just can't urge people enough to please go. And if you see me there, say hello, and you get a chance to say hello to Ron Paul and to David Stockman and Colonel McGregor and many other wonderful speakers. It's a great experience. It's a cheap experience. It's in a very nice hotel. It's not expensive to stay there. And if you live in the area, you have really no excuse for not going. So really, Daniel, I hope that I don't want to be mean and say this, but I hope you have to turn people away.
Thank you, Lew.
And Lew, we are going to sign off here in a minute or two, but I want to take a time to tell a brief little story about Murray and you, because you were helping me out in the congressional office back in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was appointed to the Gold Commission, and that's a longer story, but the Gold Commission was authorized, under Carter. But it never met. So one of the first things that had to be done was that group had to organize into the Gold Commission and have these meetings and to study the role of gold in the international and domestic gold, monetary system. And back then, gold was up to $800 and interest rates $15, and there was a monetary crisis going on. And you and I talked, and we said, well, why don't we see if we can find Murray Rothbard. I had never met Murray Rothbard. And you said, I think I can get him. And I don't know, you may have met him before, but lo and behold, you called and he came over and met with us. And that was the first time I met him. And of course, then he later on helped in the research on the Gold Commission report, the dissenting views. But that is a vivid memory with me because he was a jolly person then, and he was a jolly person throughout his life. And I miss him because I think the main reason is he would have enjoyed our presidential campaigns, unbelievably so. And he would have been doing a lot of giggling. And I'm sure you remember that little incident when he came to see us.
I sure do. I remember it with great pleasure, Ron. And it was a great thing to hook you two up. That brought just so much good for the country and for our ideas in the dissenting report of the Gold Commission, which the Mises Institute sells it. And it's a wonderful little book. I can't urge people enough to buy it and read it. It's also online, so you can read it for free on your computer if you just look at Mises.org, as it says in the background of my speech here.
Okay, very good, Lew, and we're going to sign off. And I want to thank you once again for being with us today, and looking forward to see you on the 14th. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in today, and please come back to the Liberty soon.